Valorant's anti-cheat has been a hot topic debate ever since the release of Valorant. People have been trying to dissect how Riot Vanguard functions, whether or not it actually works, and whether or not it being a rootkit is actually harmful to your security. However, one part of Valorant's anti-cheat that I don't see being discussed very often is Fog of War, the part of Valorant's anti-cheat specifically dedicated to dealing with wall hacks. So that'll be exactly what we'll be diving into today. We'll be seeing what Fog of War is and how it works. Some of you might be wondering what Fog of War even is in Valorant. I mean, I don't see no Fog of War when I play. That's because Fog of War isn't something you see like in other games, it's a system that works behind the scenes in Valorant. Being a tactical FPS, information and information gathering is an important key to victory, making tools like wall hacks extremely detrimental to the game's integrity due to their ability to give the player easy access to the enemy team's positioning with little to no effort on their part. To keep the competitive integrity alive, Riot had to implement a solution that would reduce the effectiveness of wall hacks and essentially make them a non-issue. Inspired by League of Legends' similarly named Fog of War system, Valorant's Fog of War is a section of Valorant's anti-cheat that is created to prevent wall hacks from functioning by denying them access to the data they need in the first place, essentially rendering them useless. So how does Fog of War work in Valorant? Well, Valorant's Fog of War functions on a concept of net visibility, an idea stolen from League. In every multiplayer game, there is both a client and a server. The client is your game and your computer, along with every other player's game and computer. The server is the computer where the game is hosted on. For the game to function correctly, your client must send sets of information to the server and the server must send sets of information back. These sets are called data packets. The data packets you send to the server tend to contain information such as your current health, whether or not you're moving, current position, money, the gun you have, stuff like that. The data your client gets tends to be related to other players, like where your teammates are and where the enemies are. Net visibility is the idea that only the server knows where all the players are at any given time. Essentially, when the server sends your client a data packet, it contains no data on the positioning of enemies unless the enemies are already in a position to be seen in the first place. Since your client has no data on where enemies are, wall hacks have nowhere to look for data on enemy positioning, making them unable to show you where the enemies are located. That's cool and all, but how does the server even know if a player is visible to begin with? Well, the original Fog of War system would use line of sight checks to decide whether or not a player could see another player. For this to work, every character was given a bounding box, which is essentially like a giant hitbox that encompasses the whole of a player, and is used for checking line of sight instead of hit registration. If you could see the player's bounding box, then the player would be rendered, and your client would receive the data. This worked well, but it had trouble accounting for movement abilities, such as Jet's dash or Raze's C4 jump, making it so that you wouldn't see them until it's too late. It also wouldn't work if only the player's head was visible, since the engine only counted a player as visible if you could see one of the corners of the bounding box. Current Fog of War fixes that issue by ditching the whole line of sight technique and using a different one, PVS occlusion culling lookup tables. That was a mouthful now, wasn't it? You might be wondering, what the fuck is a PVS occlusion culling lookup table? Well, occlusion culling is a technique used by developers and 3D graphic designers used to unrender objects that are not in view. Typically, this technique is used to save computing power and help things run smoothly. PVS occlusion culling stands for Potentially Visible Set Occlusion Culling, and is a type of occlusion culling Valorant uses in their game. Essentially, every map in Valorant is split up into a grid, and each square in this grid is called a node, though Valorant calls it cells. After the set of cells is calculated, the game goes through every cell and calculates which cell can be seen from that location and which cell cannot. Every cell that is visible from that location is put into a list called the cell's potentially visible set. Once the PVS, or potentially visible set, for all the cells are created, the game will use that list to decide which part of the map it should render depending on which area you are standing in. This technique only works with the environment, not entities and moving objects. So why does this matter for Fog of War? Well, for Valorant to be able to look at the PVS list in the first place, it needs to be put into something we call a lookup table. The lookup table can be accessed by other parts of the game that have nothing to do with occlusion culling. See where I'm getting at here? Instead of relying on unreliable line of sight to do the job, Riot instead checks to see whether or not an enemy player is in one of your potentially visible sets. If so, your client receives the data. If not, your client gets no data on their location or whereabouts. It's a genius and effective way to stop wall hackers. For the time being, of course. Valorant's Fog of War is an important section of Valorant's anti-cheat made to combat wall hackers by using techniques similar to PVS occlusion culling. It limits the type of data sent to the user's client. While near invisible and barely noticeable, we can rest safely knowing that this is doing its job in the background, stumping wall hackers for the time to come.